This is an AQA Psychology A-Level revision video for the Paper 2 topic of approaches with a specific focus on the humanistic approach. So let's have a look at where the humanistic approach sits on the specification and the key elements that you need to know about. They are free will, self-actualization, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, focus on the self, congruence, the role of conditions of worth, and then the influence on counselling psychology. So to get started, let's explore the main assumptions of the humanistic approach. Humanistic, humanism, and humanist, all terms in psychology that relate to an approach which studies the whole person. So straight away, that tells you something different about this approach compared to the other approaches. They emphasise the uniqueness of each individual, and they believe that personality and behaviour should be studied from the individual's subjective experience. So behaviourism and psychoanalysis are regarded as dehumanising by humanistic psychologists. This idea that our behaviour is a result of stimulus and response or our unconscious mind, they say that's very dehumanising and that we should actually consider the whole person, which is why the humanistic approach is called the third force, because they are following on from the psychodynamic approach and behaviourism, with their first key element of free will. So all approaches have been deterministic to some extent, but the humanistic approach is different because they believe that individuals are self-determining. They have free will, and that is what causes their behaviour. Not hormones, not the unconscious mind, themselves. So they do accept that external influences, like the unconscious mind or hormones, affect us, but that we're actually active agents and we can determine our own development, whether we're going to let these hormones affect our behaviour on a day-to-day basis. They also reject scientific approaches, and to be free will, they have to take a non-deterministic viewpoint. So this idea that you can pinpoint a specific cause to a behaviour, but actually they reject that because they consider the role of free will and that every individual makes their own choices. And then psychology should be concerned with the study of human behaviour and not general laws, not trying to create experiments and generalise all of those results to everybody. So they believe humans are unique and it's the subjective experience of each individual that needs to be addressed, which is why it's sometimes known as the person-centred approach. So then we move on to the hierarchy of needs and self-actualisation. So here you have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in which he says that there are 5 key elements before a person can achieve self-actualization. You have to address your physiological needs: breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, etc. Then you can progress onto your safety needs once you've got your physiological, which is the security of body, of employment, so having a job, having a house, having a family, having health, which then allows you to move up to the love and belonging stage, where you form friends, you have family connections and sexual intimacy, a romantic partner, start your own family. You can then progress up to esteem, where you develop confidence, you have a sense of achievement, you have respect of others and respect other people. And then you can self-actualize, which is about being creative, being spontaneous, not being prejudiced. And self-actualization is really about achieving your full potential, an innate desire that Maslow says all humans are born. It's within us to achieve our full potential, because personal growth is an essential part of being human. Now, not everyone reaches the higher levels because there are psychological barriers to preventing them. But the idea that Maslow had is that you progress up the hierarchy stage by stage. Once you've completed the stage, you can progress to the next one and the next one until you self-actualize, which is every human's desire, according to Maslow. And that everyone is born with this idea to be the best they can be and want to be the best they can be. We'll revisit that when we evaluate this approach. So we now move on to the focus of the self, congruence, and the role of conditions of worth. So there's a lot here to unpick. Moving away from Maslow and on to Rogers, he believed personal growth can only be achieved through the ideal self and the actual self being congruent. So that is the concept of self, the way you see yourself, who you actually are, needs to be congruent. It needs to be in line with who you want to be, your ideal self. If there is a big gap, if a person is incongruent, then they won't be able to self-actualize. And this is due to the negative feelings of self-worth they experience. So to reduce the gap and to become congruent, Rogers developed client-centered therapy, which is the influence of counselling, which we'll look at in the next slide. So Rogers believed many of the issues we experience in day-to-day life, such as low self-esteem, are rooted in childhood and are due to a lack of unconditional positive regard. That unconditional love from our parents, that I will love you no matter what. A parent who sets boundaries or limits on their love, conditions of worth for their child, by saying they will only love them if, creates psychological problems for that child in the future. So Roger believed that an effective therapist would provide clients with unconditional positive regard that they didn't get as children. So this image here. Wow, I think you're wonderful. That being praised no matter what, being boosted, being given that self-esteem from a therapist if you maybe didn't get it from your parents, if your parents placed too much conditions on your worth, made you feel like you had to earn being loved. And then if we revisit this idea of congruence in a bit more detail, you've got perceived self, so who you sort of want, who you are right now, and then your ideal self, who you want to be. So if who I am right now is a teacher, but who I want to be is a model, then I'm going to be massively incongruent, because coming to work day to day as a teacher is not going to get me where I want to be as a model. So I'm going to experience those negative feelings of self-worth. I'm going to feel like I'm not good enough, like I'm never going to be a model, that I'm not attractive enough, that I don't have the right skills and qualities to be a model. However, if I sort of move towards congruence, if I get a part-time job or do a few photo shoots for my friend on Instagram, then I might start to feel a bit more congruent. My friend might give me that confidence that I need, that boost. You know, you take a wonderful picture, you look incredible, and then I can become more congruent through that. And so I have more unconditional positive regard, I have more self-esteem, and that can help me to self-actualize and be an amazing model plastered all over billboards all over the world. So that's what Rogers meant by congruence, focus on the self, and then conditions of worth. So all three of those link into one another. Moving on to the influence on counselling psychology. So client-centered therapy, as developed by Rogers, as we've just explored, is about increasing the client's self-worth. They don't call them patients, they call them clients, to give them that empowered feeling. But it's about reducing incongruence, developing positive self-regard. So the therapist has to treat the client with warmth and support and be non-judgmental. You know, support me, encourage me to be a model, no matter what my sort of looks or skills or qualities are. So client-centered therapy has transformed and modernised psychotherapy. It modernised psychology because counselling was seen as a very beneficial tool. And so an effective therapist can provide clients with unconditional positive regard that they didn't get as children. And this has been shown to have positive outcomes on an individual's mental health, which we'll explore later on. And then just before we move on to evaluate the humanistic approach, if we consider the research and the methods that they favour, so they reject scientific methodology like experiments, and they prefer the use of qualitative research methods, so gaining detail, looking at diary accounts, having open-ended questionnaires and unstructured interviews with the individuals to find out things in depth and to understand the way people think or feel. So they might prefer the use of case studies like the psychodynamic approach. And so the way to really understand people is to sit down and talk with them, share their experiences and be open to their feelings. So those are the methods that they prefer to use, which is in stark contrast to that of behaviourism, cognitive approach and the biological approach, for example. So with that all in mind, here's an opportunity to pause the video and think of some strengths and weaknesses of the humanistic approach. And we'll have a look at those in 5 seconds. So we've got the strength of being applied to the therapeutic treatment. So client-centered therapy is very useful and it can help individuals develop self-regard and overcome the incongruence that they experience. They're the only approach to emphasise choice and free will, which all other approaches ignore. They're very holistic. They're the only approach to consider all aspects of an individual. So if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and those 5 different categories, considering all elements of a person and what it is that's stopping them from self-actualizing. They are much more sensitive than other approaches. They place less burden on an individual because they explore all of the different things that could be causing their behaviour. And then they're qualitative and rich in detail. So they don't try to create superficial laws that apply to everyone, they just care about the individual. However, because they're qualitative, not being able to create general laws means they're not scientific, which is not good for psychology. They've got very vague terms such as self-actualization, and so there's little empirical research because they're very untestable concepts. Not all cultures share this idea of self-actualization, so there's a massive cultural bias. It's only really Western culture that favours individual development and self-actualizing as an individual. Sort of Eastern cultures prefer to look after the needs of the group, so massive cultural bias. And then, yes, it's led to counselling psychology, but counselling isn't actually as effective as things like CBT and antidepressants. So we've got some evidence here on the next slide for you to have a look. It's an opportunity to pause the video, note down the evidence and think about whether they support or refute the humanistic approach. And you can use these imperial paragraphs as evidence to go alongside the previous strengths and weaknesses that we've just gone through. So pause the video, have 5 seconds before I go through the answers. So haggerty is actually a weakness. It refutes the humanistic approach for the reason of cultural bias. So looking at the different countries, he found that countries in the early stages of economic development didn't really progress up Maslow's hierarchy. So it shows that actually it's only Western cultures that see individual development as important. Harter et al. Is support for the approach and this idea that we should take a holistic approach, because teenagers who feel they have to fulfill certain conditions end up not liking themselves, they end up disliking themselves. So it is about that importance of understanding the individual, being holistic, being subjective in an approach and helping individuals rather than trying to create general laws. And then finally, the study by Nevis is also cultural bias, because it's that Western ideal to be individualistic, because in China, belongingness needs are actually more important than physiological needs and self-actualization. So it is about the group rather than the individual. Whereas Europeans and Americans, that Western culture, it's all about an individual. But Chinese, Japanese and Koreans define self-concept in terms of social relationships and connection with others. So this is another weakness in terms of cultural bias. So that concludes the end of this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.